recorded part one. That was, I don't know, maybe a month or so ago, maybe a little more. I can't remember exactly, but there was definitely a sense that as we recorded, I wasn't really out yet publicly. You knew, I knew, and there were lots of people that knew on a small scale. I guess I shouldn't say lots, but there were people that knew on a much smaller scale. Right. And so it was interesting to try to navigate that conversation because I wanted to be authentic and share my story, but also not share too much of my story or more than I was comfortable with at the time. Of course, the release date just so happened that it came out after I was publicly out, which now I feel more free though to talk about it and talk about that experience of coming out and talk about just being trans in general and my own journey with that. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot there that certainly was touched on in some way in the first episode, but not really explored.
Absolutely. You guys, it is so exciting to be able to introduce Lana as herself because we were navigating this line of being honest about her journey of understanding her sexuality. And of course, sexuality and gender often really go together. And I mean, as you heard Lana share at the beginning of last episode, part of her understanding her sexuality was understanding that she didn't feel like the other boys. And now perhaps that has multiple layers, right? Mm-hmm. I'd love to start with sort of the same piece we started with last time, which was, what were you taught growing up?
Yeah, so I think as a kid, I remember seeing very clear gender roles. And it wasn't necessarily in the way of like women stay at home and men do the work, because like in the world that I came from, everyone had to work. Like there wasn't a division of work in the sense of like only some people worked outside the home. Pretty much everyone that I knew was working outside the home who was an adult. But what was different was that, women also did the cooking usually. Men would do barbecue, but women would cook in the home, right? Men would cook outside the home, literally outside in the yard. And certainly there was, I remember at church, like the preacher was always a man. So there was a clear sense that like the genders had different functions, but both of them needed to work. And if anything, the women did more of the behind the scenes work that benefited everyone, whereas the men sort of got to do the more public facing work. And that definitely bothered me. I do feel like I saw a disconnect between what women were maybe celebrated for, like they were, celebrated as good cooks and like good housekeepers or good caretakers. And there was also a different expectation around emotion. For instance, I can think about how I would say, like, coming from a Southern culture, I did see men cry. Like, it wasn't that men didn't cry, but it was that they were slower to show emotion than women. There was a sense in which there were places where it was okay for men to cry, and women had a little more leeway, it felt like, in terms of expressing emotion. So I think I was sort of taught, that there are these differences, particularly around emotion and the kinds of work that the two different, and of course, I was certainly taught there were two genders, there were men and women, or boys and girls, male or female. There was no anything else.
I remember you saying last time that you didn't even know that there was an option for someone not to be heterosexual. Was there ever any talk of sort of people who defied these different norms, or maybe even people who were starting to explore the kind of things you've explored over the last few years as you've tried to figure out where you find yourself to be on the gender spectrum?
Yeah, so I don't remember, certainly like when I lived with my grandparents, I don't remember seeing any like examples of gender non-conforming people. It was all sort of like these are the genders, and I felt so constricted. I felt like people were looking at me and saying that I was a boy, and therefore I had to perform in these ways. I had to like the outdoors. I had to want to hunt one day because men hunted in our community. But it
Mm.
was like, I just want to hang out with the girls. I want to do what they're doing. Like that to me seems fulfilling. Um, but I remember when I was maybe 5 and Ricky Lake was on TV. We had moved away from my grandparents. We were living in Tampa at the time, so much more of a metropolitan area. And we were, I think it was just me. I think Ricky Lake was just like on in the background. But I remember there was a little trans girl on TV, and
Mm.
they were talking to the mom about how she, made the decision that she would allow her child to live as a girl. And I was like, oh my gosh, I think that's me. Like I can really identify with that. And and yet I never saw that reflected in the world around me. It was only like some really distant reality that was happening somewhere with one person in the world.
Mm.
And yet, that was one of the first times where I really felt like I understood what was happening to me.
So that was such a young age, and yet you're saying it wasn't reflected. And so you had all of a sudden this sense of like someone else has gone through something like this, but that sort of someone else was not anywhere to be found nearby.
Right. And it certainly didn't feel safe to like go tell someone like, oh, I'm like this kid. It still felt like this is a secret. And I think certainly in this case, with this secret came shame.
Mm.
Like I was the problem. Something was wrong with me, and I should not be telling people that that's what's wrong with me because people will no longer love me.
Mm. So hard to have our identities tied up as that, of us as problem, rather than, I feel like, sort of in terms of developmental stages, like perhaps early adolescence is the first time when you're really thinking about like pushing back against what has been offered to you. But
Mhm.
that is allowed in some communities more than it is allowed in others.
Right.
I didn't grow up religious. I didn't have the sort of like capital C church sitting over my family in that way. So I was able to push back on things that maybe you couldn't, or at least definitely didn't feel like you could.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, yeah, there's definitely no sense in which we could, well, in which I felt like I could push back on these ideas. There was a longing to. I mean, it's kind of interesting because when my mom married my stepdad, he was like their decision was to not go to church. So once they got married and we moved away, I wasn't going to church, but I
Mm.
already had a sense of what the church, at least my grandparents' church and my grandparents expected from me out of life.
Mm.
Not like I had this fully developed theology, but I certainly had these implicit understandings from observing them and from just witnessing their lives and the things that they did talk about.
Mhm.
was enough for me to have a sense of like, this is how things ought to be. And
Mm.
I am not in the category of ought to be. So I need to conceal myself, hide myself, become something different.
I'd love to come back to that ought to be idea later, because I imagine that that comes up at so many different points in your journey along the way. This sense of like shame coming out in this phrase of like, I ought to be like this. And then eventually coming to the understanding of like, the world ought to be a little bit more like dot, dot, dot,
Hmm.
liberating, freeing. But I'd love to come back to that because I feel ought to be. What was it about the girls and women that you related with more? You said you felt like their activities were more fulfilling to you, which is a big word for a 4-year-old, right? Like, but you already knew that the activities that the men were doing weren't as close to your heart.
Right. I mean, like for instance, my grandpa would go hunting, and he would hunt deer. Like I had no interest in hunting, but I did have interest in like making crafts with my grandma. And I did have interest in um, like being in the kitchen and seeing what they were doing. And like the way that they talked to each other was different than the way I saw men talk to each other. Like there was more of a sense of community. Um, Not that the men didn't have community, because I certainly feel that they do, but it was like they were the caregivers of the community, the women were, and I felt very much like I wanted to be a caregiver. I wanted to take care of other people. And I could tell that they were taking care of me. And certainly that was true. Like my grandpa was taking care of me as well, like, but he wasn't doing it to the same emotional level that like my grandma was, for instance. There was a nurturing, a sort of like emotional, I don't even know, like a gooiness to her love that was like being wrapped in cookie dough or something, like I don't even know. But
Sounds like you longed for a sense of intimacy with others that perhaps wasn't there, with this like pretty rigid understanding of who men are and who like what men ought to like to do and how they are supposed to be in relationship with other people, and with the church doing these like, as you said, sort of like the more front line, like they're in the positions that are being seen, whereas the women may be like propping it up in the background.
mhm. Yeah. And there was a longing that I had for the women to be seen for the work that they were doing. Growing up, my grandma, she is never allowed to be called a preacher, but she was definitely like, she would, she was allowed to lead. They have this prayer time in their church where somebody gets up there and they like take prayer requests, kind of like joys and concerns in a lot of mainline churches. They call them prayer requests and praise reports, just different
Mhm.
language, but it's a very informal time. And it's usually lay led in their community. And my grandma was often one of the people doing it, one of the few women who did it. And she would sort of like preach as she did it. It was like she would step into this authority and this sense of like talking out of her own experience of God's love.
Mhm.
And even though like theologically I have lots of disagreements with my grandma, like I always wanted for her the capacity to be recognized for those gifts and for the church to make space for her to really lean into that. Like if she had grown up in a different world, I imagine she would have been a pastor. Like she's a community creator, she's a caregiver. Like these things that we often, for sure in Southern culture, put on women are really pastoral like work. And so And I think that's the really sticky thing, right? Is like the older that I got and the more that I did learn, like I remember looking at the Jesus story and thinking, I just felt so torn up inside when the
Mm.
church that I was at in high school was, they were more like a neo-charismatic church, like a Pentecostal sort of like, speaking in tongues, being slain in the spirit, like very ecstatic in their expression, like lifting up their hands and clapping and singing, shouting, like a very, very expressive church. But they had very clear distinctions again about gender.
Mm.
And it was interesting though, because they allowed women to preach. Like the church was founded by a woman. Like for them,
Mhm.
and even the phrase they allowed women to preach, right? It still
Uh-huh.
suggests a patriarchal structure in which the men are the ones who even have to open the door, right? They're the gatekeepers still in this
Mhm.
scenario. But they believed that women were called to preach and teach in the church. And so it was like I suddenly had this other vision of like, oh, look, women can do this and women are doing this.
Mm.
But there were still limits. Like I think they still taught the idea that the man is the head of the house and the wives have to submit to their husbands, which was always weird to me because it just feels like such a dichotomy. Like you're telling me that the pastor, I mean, by the time I got there, the pastor wasn't a woman. She had moved to another church. But and like you're telling me she leads this whole congregation and then goes home and submits to her husband.
Mm.
Right? Like she can be a leader in a much larger space, but as soon as she's in the nuclear family space, nope, no
Mm.
more leadership. Like it just felt like such a strange boundary to me that didn't really make sense and I didn't see how that could play out in real life very well. Um, so like there was certainly that piece, but I think what it did for me was it showed me that gender is not so fixed and like these roles are not as fixed to gender as we make them and certainly as the world that I grew up in made them. It was like one of those moments of seeing a crack in that boundary line, like, oh, there is a way or there are places where these roles are different, they play
Mm.
out very differently.
What a powerful image, that crack in the facade, the crack in what you had been taught that seemed unbreakable because you had never seen anybody do other than that, even though you have this grandma who you believe would have been a pastor had she been born in a different time or in a different denomination or church. There's this, again, that adolescent piece of like, you're starting to see like there could actually be a different world here. If this crack exists, what else does? What else is a lot less durable than I thought?
Mhm.
What was it like for you as, when did you decide to go into ministry and what was the scene that it happened?
So I was 14 when I decided to become a pastor. So I was attending that church in high school. I had been there several months. And for me, I just sort of fell in love with, uh, I mean, at the time, I framed it as I'm falling in love with Jesus. There was this real sense in which God became a very personal presence. God was not detached, but God was intimately involved in my life, is how I experienced God in that community. And so I remember it was that spring break, we were visiting my grandma and my cousin asked me, she's like, do you still want to be a teacher? Which is what I had wanted to be for years. I mean, I used to go to Future Educators of America conference. I was that person, which was actually a really great conference.
Mhm.
Um, but I remember the words that came out of my mouth were, no, I think I'm going to be a preacher.
Mm.
And my grandma put her hand over my hand and said, I've always known. And it was just this really like sweet moment. And, that has meant a lot of different things to me, and I'm continuing to rework what that calling means to me. But I do like that moment did change a lot for me because it did at the time set me on a path towards pursuing ministry. And I didn't come up from a world where seminary was a thing. I didn't even really know what seminary was, but I knew that, like, for instance, I was like, well, I need to take speech class now to make sure that I'm learning how to do public speaking. Like, I began to set my course for these things, for like preparing for a public ministry, a vocational ministry. And it was, I mean, at the time, I certainly believed that there were men and women in the world, and God called both men and women. But I was surrounded by many people who didn't even believe that. Like, I would constantly argue with friends, several of whom were women, who would say women could not be called to preach. And that was so like frustrating for me. It's like, but you're a woman, don't like, don't you care about this? So it just, yeah, I think for me, I ended up moving in that direction. And that's what ultimately led me to go to Southeastern University and Assemblies of God School, Pentecostal, and that's where a lot more of the cracks in my foundation began to come up, particularly as I took more advanced Bible classes. And I mean, I talked about this in the last part, but it was really in writing my master's thesis where I was like, oh, like this whole story is about change and is about how we discern God in the midst of change and how we learn to be open to that change. And it's not, I think that we have to balance out, like, it's not some like forceful push into a future that's against people's will, but it's an invitation to dance with the divine into this new world, a world where people are made whole and seen for who they are. It's a different kind of understanding of what God is up to in the world.
What are the dance moves that you wish people had offered you along your training when you were still presenting as a man?
I think something that I wish that I would have had was, even looking at seminary, I wish that there would have been more explicit conversation around trans identity. I think that when I was in seminary, that was the first time that I really met trans people. So both at seminary, but also I ended up going to the Q Christian conference at the time. It was called GCN, Gay Christian Network Conference. And that was my first time like going to hear trans presenters in person and hearing their stories and being so intrigued, but also so terrified to listen to them. Because it was like, I don't want this to be true about me, because then I will need to go on some other journey that I just don't know if I can go on right now. But I wish that I knew that people around me were more open to this, or more loving, or more caring. I wish that it wasn't such a thing that I felt like people didn't know about. It was like, of course, in seminary, especially because we had a few trans folks in seminary, of course, it was like it would come up in conversation. But even I would hear people's hesitation around these things, or their sort of, it was like there were yield signs that came up for them when they talked about it. Like there was something that kept them from fully embracing it, or from being able to really say, oh, I for sure affirm fully and stand with trans folks. There was like a hesitation, even if it wasn't conscious for them, but I could hear it in the way that they talked about these things. And it reaffirmed my own yield signs within my heart.
You ought not to go there.
Right.
That journey would be even more difficult than the one you've already done.
Yes.
Coming out as gay.
Yeah.
Haven't you already done enough journeying?
Right. Yeah. It just felt so scary, so terrifying, and overwhelming.
So having a few voices of human assurance for you.
Yes.
Not just for the folks who supported, it sounds like such a terrible baseline to support someone else's identity, but to be able to look at you and say, like, you, if you were going on this journey, that would be great too. We'd love and support you. And we believe God would love and support you. There's nothing you can do to lose God's love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like I needed safety. I needed to know that I would not be left alone if I went on the journey. And at the time, I was so new to like the LGBTQ world in general that it was like, and I came out as gay when Caitlyn Jenner transitioned publicly. So my coming out sort of coincided with this major, like, Kardashian family person that was like major headlines. And I remember seeing the way people reacted. And I was like, I don't want that kind of reaction. I can't even think about if that is about me. I'm not even in that place because the world that I see is not even safe for her. So what makes me think that it would be safe for me? But again, it was like I couldn't even acknowledge, right? In asking that question, I couldn't even acknowledge that I was asking the question about me. Like I still wasn't accepting of the fact that my own gender identity was much less clear than my sexual orientation. I mean, even that, right? People were still questioning me from where the world I came from. Like, are you sure this is true about you? Maybe you're wrong. How do you know?
Yeah. It's already hard enough with that one thing that you felt very confident in, of like, you had been married to your best friend from college and you were like, I don't belong here. I belong elsewhere because I'm not straight. So there was like this place where you felt like, I don't have belonging here, so there is somewhere else here. But maybe there wasn't that sort of space for a gender journey.
Right. At least not yet. I mean, I think by the end of seminary, I had learned about more non-binary, genderqueer identities. And I remember coming to a place where it was like, I think that I probably fall somewhere in that category. So I started using genderqueer to describe my own gender identity. I didn't really want to make a huge thing about it because, again, I felt so sort of like I felt insecure in embracing that. But it did open up a world for me where it was like, I'm going to try painting my nails. I'm going to try putting on eyeshadow. I'm going to try mascara. It was like these small little things that finally there was a new world opening up to me.
When did you feel it open up enough for you to finally say, I think genderqueer described a certain part of my journey, And now the word that I more identify with is trans.
And that wasn't until this year.
Mm.
I mean, I noticed that I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with people calling me he or him. I noticed that I I mean, I have had like a sense of discomfort and disease with my own body for a long, long time, but
Mm.
it just felt like, I don't know, I think I was noticing it more. Like it was coming up more and more. And then I took a trauma class for, my mental health counseling degree in the spring. And I just remember the first day of class, we did this meditation and I was sobbing. I was like, I don't know why I'm so overwhelmed with emotion right now. It was surprising. It caught me off guard. And I remember in therapy, I just started saying, like, there's something in my childhood that I feel really disconnected from, and I don't really know what it is.
Mm.
But I know that I need to explore it. I know that I'm feeling disintegrated.
Mm.
And like the way that I framed it was, it's almost like there's this box that's been like, there's lots of chains around the box. The key's been thrown away and it's deep in my unconscious mind. And I can't even, I'm like, I now know that the box is there. I know that it's been there my whole life, but I don't really know what's in it and I'm scared to look in it.
Mm.
So it just like was, I don't know, multiple therapy sessions of me just sort of crying. And it was like, I don't really know what I'm feeling so disconnected about.
Mm.
Um, it was like, I know, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, even I went back and was looking in my journal, and I had written earlier in the year that I sat in therapy that I was trans, but I don't even remember saying that. Like
Mm.
I was dissociating so much from that identity, from that sense of being, that I was like living this split inner world.
Mm.
So I ended up um, I ended up coming to a place of just sort of recognizing, okay, I think I have gender dysphoria. And then I was also taking a psychopathology class. And of course, gender dysphoria is in the DSM. And we got to that chapter in the DSM. And I was like, well, I feel like this is describing, like it was when I read about childhood gender dysphoria, I was like, that describes me to a T.
Mm.
And it was a little harder for me to connect with the adult piece because I didn't want to connect.
Mm.
And I had this thought, this like line of thinking that was like, well, if maybe I can just let that go. Maybe I can just recognize, like, yeah, I had gender dysphoria as a child, and maybe every now and then I experience dysphoria, and I can grieve that and let it go. Like,
Mm.
I will just continue living my life as I've lived my life now for 30 some odd years, and, you know, it's fine. We'll figure it out.
Would you
And
mind defining gender dysphoria for
yeah,
folks who don't know what it is? And I'm interested in hearing the experiences of childhood and adulthood because I've never thought about those different definitions of it, that they would have that marked down in the DSM.
yeah. So certainly, like gender dysphoria at large is about experiencing some kind of disconnect between your own internal experience of your gender and the way that you feel it in your body, or the way that you feel it in the roles that you perform, or the way that you look, the way that you present to the world, for instance, the way you dress, the way you sound. Um, and so, specifically in children, it often shows up as like children not wanting to perform anticipated gender roles, right? Even though everyone around them is sort of performing those roles, and it's seen as normative in their world, but for them there's some resistance. It feels like there's something that they can't quite connect to.
Mm,
um, and so for me as a kid, right, like that sort of goes back to talking about just feeling like I wasn't connecting to the roles that I was expected to play as a boy. I
mm,
didn't want to be rough and tough. The way that one of my family members would describe me was that I was a city boy, which was his
mm,
way of saying like that I wasn't a country boy. I didn't want to play outside and get dirty. I didn't want to roll around in the mud.
mm,
I played outside a lot though, but I wasn't trying to like go like get dirty and be rough and tough. I was playing house outside, or I was the princess that needed to be saved. Like there was this strong disconnect with the way that other people perceived me and told me who I was. Like I believed as a child that they were profoundly wrong, that they were not
mm,
seeing something, but that I couldn't convince them. I couldn't, like, there was no way of changing their minds about who I was.
mm,
And that was like a really hard, for me as a kid, that was so hard to grasp. And that's what caused so much of that dissociation in my life, in which, right? So, like in psychology, dissociation, similar to the word disassociation, dissociation is like dissociative identity disorder, right? That's like a more extreme form of dissociation. Everybody dissociates to some degree. Like daydreaming is an example of dissociation, but um, there are more ongoing examples of dissociation, right? So people who have trauma, usually what happens is in their psyche, a part of their psyche dissociates because it's too much for the psyche to hold the trauma. So the
mm,
psyche splits and the trauma gets held in a different part of the psyche, not disappearing from the psyche, but being disconnected. So then there are these like sort of fractures in the person's psyche. So for me, I think that's sort of what happened as a child, right? I just began to fracture myself in order to hold the way that people saw me and the way that I saw myself. I began to recognize that from a very early age that people would not believe this reality. So I just had to put that reality somewhere else,
mm,
as I think of this sort of box that's, wrapped in chains and the keys thrown away, and I cast it into the depths of my unconscious mind. And, but again, just because it's cast into the depths of my unconscious, it's still there, right? Like it kept popping up. It kept getting triggered by different events in my life. Like I remember in middle school, for instance, when my voice started changing, that was such a hard reality for me. It
mm,
was like I didn't really want my voice to change, but also at the same time, I wanted it to change because I wanted to be accepted by the people around me. Like I didn't want to grow facial hair, but I also wanted to grow facial hair so maybe I could be more acceptable to the world, right? There
mm,
were always these dueling parts of me, especially as I entered puberty, which can be one of the most challenging times for gender dysphoria because it's really, right, when your secondary sex characteristics, for instance, growing a beard, growing breasts, getting hair around your body, all of those different characteristics that we just naturally go through can be terrifying for trans kids. And yet, for me, at that point, I was already so dissociated from any sense that I was a girl, but also recognizing that that reality was still held so deep within me.
mm,
It's so hard to describe, like to be connected to that reality, but also deeply disconnected from that reality. Like, I remember I wasn't allowed to play with Barbies or have Barbies, because those were girls' toys. But I found a way around it by I loved Star Wars and I loved Queen Amidala. and they came out with Star Wars dolls. Like, so I had the Star Wars action figures, they're like 6 inches or whatever, but I got full on Queen Amidala dolls where I could change her outfits and I could do her hair. And it was like my way of getting to have a Barbie. Or I had a Poison Ivy and Batman doll, and it was like I could do Poison Ivy's hair. It was like my way of being able to touch a world that I was told I was not allowed to touch.
Mm.
So I felt like I learned also a subversiveness when I was a kid. I learned how to find ways to break the boundaries without transgressing the boundary.
Mm.
I learned how to like put my finger on the boundary without crossing it fully.
Mm. Sounds exhausting.
It was exhausting, and it has created lots of trauma responses even now that I still deal with, that I'm learning how to, or I'm unlearning these responses, right? I'm having to unlearn that, like, not every moment do I have to. I mean, one of the effects of that was that I learned that I had to pay extra close attention to what people were saying so I could know the ins and outs and know where the boundaries were. And
Mm.
if I somehow missed, like, if I missed the boundary, then like I needed to learn how to not miss it the next time.
Mm.
Right? Like I felt like I had to learn perfection around people's boundaries. So in effect, I no longer had my own boundaries because my life became about learning what other people's boundaries were. It became about learning what the social boundaries were and learning how to stay within those,
Mm.
but also feeling immensely frustrated by those social boundaries. Like there was like a hatred of those boundaries, but also, I mean, those boundaries felt like a master to me. Like I had to follow them. Otherwise, I would lose all love.
You ought to be a rule follower.
Yes.
And I feel like this is often a thing for any of our listeners who know the Enneagram at all. Both Lana and I are Enneagram 2s. And Enneagram 2, the helper, the deepest fear is being unloved or unimportant or, even sort of unnecessary if their help isn't needed. But really, it's about like, I want to do good so that I am perceived as good, which means that I am lovable.
Right. Yes.
So these wounds come from deep,
Yep.
and it's a really important thing to unlearn that like love is so dang conditional,
Yes.
that like it could be as uncertain as which way the wind goes, whether someone is going to love you today. Maybe they'll love you tomorrow, but today, if you say or do the wrong thing, quote unquote, that at least for today, you have lost someone's love.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And as I've gotten older, and I think something that has helped me, particularly in coming out this time around, is I think that I've been learning that love is not so fragile. And that if
Mm.
it is so fragile, then perhaps it's not the love that I'm really looking for.
Mm.
I think that to live in such a way that I'm always having to figure out what the boundaries are is a scarcity mindset, right? And part of that's because as a child, there was a scarcity of understanding in terms of
Mm.
understanding my identity as trans, right? And that's culturally, that was true. That was true in my family. I mean, there was virtually little to no representation of trans kids in the media. Certainly none that was like really great and positive and that made people have all the like ooey gooey feelings for trans kids, you know? And I think as an adult, I'm having to unlearn that scarcity and say, there's actually more in the world than I think there is.
Mm.
There's actually more goodness, there's more love, and there's more hope. And I can lean into that reality. Like when I came out publicly a few weeks ago now, maybe 2 weeks, I I mean, that was like my most popular post on social media. I was like, oh, like I was kind of surprised when I came out as gay before. I had lots of mixed reactions. I had mostly positive, but there were definitely people, partly because of the world that I was coming from, who were very willing to share their opinions so publicly on
Mm.
social media about me being queer. And this time around, there was none of that.
Mm.
It was sort of like the burden was on them to be silent.
Mm.
And everyone else, like there was just so much love and affirmation. And even coming out to my church, like there was so much fear for me. And again, this like scarcity of I'm going to lose their love. I'm going to lose their respect. I'm going to lose their trust. And yet, that hasn't been the case at all.
Mm.
And so, being able to hold, I mean, the way that I think about it is from a research perspective, right? I have this hypothesis that I have had since I was a child, and sure, there was some data to back it up.
Mm.
But I've collected a lot more data now, and I'm able to analyze that data now. And I'm able to see that the data is actually skewed towards more than it is towards scarcity.
Mm.
Yes, there is harm. Yes, there is pain. Yes, there is suffering. And yes, there is a lot of ignorance, and certainly still a lot of ignorance around trans issues. But, or rather, and there's also a willingness on many people's parts to learn, to grow, to be humble, and to say, I actually don't know.
Mm.
And that's what I have found much more in coming out this time.
Mm.
I mean, part of it is, yes, like for me, the privilege of the community that I've been able to live in, the people that I've been able to meet, the relationships I've been able to form. And my hope is, especially when I think about people who are like me, little Lanas who
Mm.
lived in a place where there just wasn't any knowledge about this. My hope is that we are creating a world where that knowledge is more readily available and accessible to people.
Mm. I remember seeing a tweet recently that was like, God made wheat and we are able to make bread. God made grapes and we are able to make wine. If God didn't want us to be creative and to help be co-creators, God wouldn't have given us the ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
God gave you some good ingredients here to have that freedom and to have a community that, for the most part, either, as you said, put the burden on themselves to stay silent this time rather than posting something rude or inflammatory on your post, but also that you were surprised by how unfragile so much of the love was. I mean, I think there were like 100 comments on this post. I was so
Yeah.
thrilled when I was going through my social media and saw that, because I know we had talked about how nervous you were, understandably, because this is a weird world sometimes. And yet, losing that, like learning to let go of that scarcity mindset, really paid off here, I think, in
Mm-hmm.
so many different ways. And I
Right.
think your decision and ability to have this courageous space and this courageous heart will continue to pay off for the rest of your life. And I dearly feel for people whose situations are simply not safe for them to do that. where, as you said, like there is actual scarcity.
Right.
Because everyone deserves an unfragile love. Everybody has unfragile love from God. And yet we also need human hands to be God's hands. We need human minds to represent God's mind. We are each other's keeper. And it's been such a joy for me as a friend of yours to see that people are keeping you in this time with that unfragile love.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And my hope is that, like you said, not everybody is in a place where they are safe. Not everybody has the resources or has a world around them that is willing to embrace them. And so, with that reality in mind, my hope is that, I see the kingdom of God, the reign of God, the kingdom of God as largely about a redistribution of resources. And I don't think that it's just resources that we can touch and taste and feel and smell. I think it's resources that we feel with our bodies, our hearts, our minds. I think it's resources of love and joy. And so I think my hope is that we would redistribute those resources as well, that we would learn to take stock of where the love is in us and where do we distribute that love and how might we redistribute that love more equitably as a culture, as a society, as a church.
Mhm.
Because people need it. People need love.
What is one way that you want to do that through your church as you serve as their pastor for however long it is that you get to serve in Glen Cove, New York? What is that mark of love that you hope to leave?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, part of it is just the willingness to say, here I am, this is me, and this is who I am, and I love me. And I, as the pastor, do have a different kind of power to create a space where people can come here and say, this is me,
Mm.
right? Certainly, especially when it comes to different kinds of identities, right? They feel so personal, so deep to who we are. And there often is this, especially for trans identities, this dysphoric experience. And I want it to be a place where people can come with whatever experience they have internally and externally and just be, exist, breathe, and know that they are loved.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much always for your courage and for your leadership and for putting abstract thoughts into very concrete words in ways that I think are part of your spiritual gift of teaching and preaching. Thank you for teaching me more today. And thank you for giving us the story of you, part 2.
Well, thank you so much for asking me the questions and helping me process through it all. I always benefit from having someone who can talk it out with me. So thank you.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.